Envision Japan during a period when the bygone grandeur of authority had faded, and noble lineage no longer served as a dependable safeguard. In those uncertain times, samurai, who just yesterday were devoted to their lords, betrayed them without a qualm. Monks, having cast aside spiritual practices, took up arms, and the most cunning and ruthless individuals shaped the destinies of entire provinces. Ancient laws were consigned to oblivion, while new laws were written with the edge of a sword. This is not a fabrication, not a beautiful legend, but the harsh reality in which Japan existed in the latter half of the 15th century. Subscribe to our channel if you haven't already. There are many more interesting videos ahead, and we will continue further. The country, once united under the rule of a single shogun, now resembled a patchwork quilt of dozens of warring provinces. Powerful clans, who not long ago had sworn oaths of eternal loyalty, now with a maniacal frenzy pillaged each other's lands, and their rulers, surrounded by intrigues and conspiracies, perished at the hands of their own vassals. The authority of the Ashikaga shogunate, which once seemed unshakable, crumbled into dust like a house of cards, burying beneath its ruins hopes for stability. Every influential feudal lord, possessing sufficient power and ambition, dreamed of becoming the new master of the country, uniting it under their leadership. This period in Japanese history became known as the Sengoku Jidai, or the Age of Warring States, a time when war became not an unfortunate exception, but a harsh, everyday norm of life. Military and political alliances were forged for a single day, only to be broken in the blink of an eye, and each battle transformed into a sophisticated game of the mind, where treachery and betrayal were the main tools for achieving victory. If this era were to be adapted into a dramatic series, the plot would be an order of magnitude more intricate and complex than in the famous Game of Thrones, and at the same time far more realistic and truthful than any historical epic. But even in this utter chaos, in this endless succession of wars and intrigues, there were people who managed to take the fate of the country into their own hands, defying circumstances and forging their own path to power. These were bright and extraordinary personalities, each with their own unique story, individual methods, and clearly defined goals. Among them stood out Oda Nobunaga, a man obsessed with the idea of destroying the old world, burning it to the ground in order to build a new, more just society on the ashes. He did not believe in outdated traditions, despised aristocrats, and valued strength and decisiveness above all else. Another outstanding figure of this era was Toyotomi Hideyoshi, a native of the lowest strata of society, who began his journey as a simple soldier, an armor-bearer, but thanks to his intelligence, cunning, and talent, managed to become the one who united the country. He was not only a great military leader, but also a master of espionage and diplomacy, skillfully using these tools to achieve his goals. And finally, Ieyasu Tokugawa, the most patient and far-sighted strategist in Japan, who managed to outlive all his enemies and learn to draw lessons even from defeats in order to ultimately achieve a triumphant victory. But their path to power was marked by blood and suffering. On their path to their cherished goal, they had to confront the greatest military commanders of their time, endure betrayal from their closest associates, suppress uprisings, uncover conspiracies, survive ninja assassinations, and withstand countless intrigues. To understand how these individuals managed to alter the course of history, it is necessary to return to the very beginning, to the moment when Japan plunged into the abyss of chaos and internecine warfare. The second half of the 15th century became a turning point in Japanese history. The country, which for centuries had been maintained in a fragile balance between the power of the shogunate and the influence of the clan aristocracy, found itself on the brink of an abyss, ready to plunge into the depths of endless wars and devastation. Kyoto, once the glittering capital of Japan, a symbol of its greatness and prosperity, transformed into an arena of fierce conflict, which in just 10 years radically changed the face of the state, leaving an indelible mark on its history. This war, which went down in history as the Onin War, did not erupt suddenly. It was preceded by many factors that gradually eroded the foundations of society. Shogun Ashikaga Yoshimasa, a refined man distant from state affairs, preferred to spend his time enjoying art and culture, paying insufficient attention to the administration of the country and not thinking about the future. For a long time, he had no heir, and therefore chose his younger brother, Ashikaga Yoshimi, as his successor, a man who seemed worthy to take his place. It seemed that the decision had been made and the succession of power was secured. But fate, as is often the case, decreed otherwise, making its own adjustments to the shogun's plans. In 1465, Ashikaga Yoshimasa unexpectedly had a son, casting doubt on all previous agreements. The question of succession to the throne, which had recently seemed settled, now became a cause for open conflict between various political forces. The two most influential clans in Japan, the Hosokawa and the Yamana, became embroiled in a power struggle, each supporting their own side in this dispute. The Hosokawa, who by that time controlled a significant part of the shogunate's political life, supported Ashikaga Yoshimi, while the powerful Yamana clan supported the infant Yoshihisa, seeing in him an opportunity to strengthen their position at court. In 1467, the streets of Kyoto turned into a battlefield where the fate of the country was decided. Samurai from both factions flooded the capital, combat units patrolled the streets, and soon the first clashes began, escalating into full-scale battles. But none of the participants in the conflict could even imagine that this war would drag on for a whole decade and almost completely destroy Kyoto, turning it from a prosperous city into ruins. The city burned again and again, engulfed in the flames of fires that mercilessly consumed wooden temples and elegant bridges, demolished noble quarters, turning once vibrant streets into lifeless ruins. Samurai, having lost all control of themselves, looted, killed and destroyed, sowing chaos and death around them. Kyoto, once the center of culture, trade and power, became a graveyard of hopes and dreams, a symbol of decline and destruction. The summer of 1473 was particularly cruel and bloody. After several years of incessant chaotic clashes and fierce battles, the troops of the Hosokawa clan, at the cost of huge losses and incredible efforts, managed to occupy a significant part of the capital city. However, the Yamana clan, unwilling to accept defeat and relinquish control over Kyoto, resorted to extreme measures, ordering the burning of entire neighborhoods, turning the city into a raging sea of fire. The raging elements, sparing nothing in their path, spread to the imperial palace, forcing the emperor himself, the head of state and spiritual leader of the nation, to seek refuge in the surrounding temples in order to escape imminent death. Chronicles of those times testify with horror that by 1474, only charred ruins and bodies of the dead, scattered everywhere, who had fallen victim to the fratricidal war, remained of the once majestic Kyoto. When the flames of war gradually subsided, dispersing the smoke and revealing a sad picture of devastation, it became finally obvious that the shogun was no longer the sovereign ruler of Japan, capable of controlling the situation in the country. He was still in Kyoto, his court surrounded by scholars, advisors, and art masters, creating the appearance of former greatness. But all this no longer had any practical significance. Real power, the real force determining the fate of the country, now belonged to the daimyo, the military rulers of individual provinces who no longer needed the shogun's sanction to govern their lands and give orders to their troops. Ashikaga Yoshimasa, a weak and indecisive leader, incapable of making difficult decisions and taking responsibility, finally withdrew from state affairs, preferring to spend time in his new palace, admiring exquisite gardens and developing an aesthetic that would later become the foundation of Japanese culture. It was during his reign that such arts as ikebana, no theater, and the tea ceremony flourished, becoming an integral part of Japanese culture. However, In a world where strength and cruelty prevail, refinement and grace are not able to protect against external threats. After his death in 1490, power formally passed to his son, Ashikaga Yoshihisa, but this no longer changed anything. Kyoto ceased to be the center of the country, and the shogun became merely a nominal figure, a puppet in the hands of the powerful, whom they could use for their own purposes, hiding behind his authority. By the end of the 15th century, there was effectively no single ruler in Japan capable of uniting the country under his leadership. Formally, there was an emperor, but he, like the shogun, did not possess real power and did not govern the state, but only performed ritual duties, maintaining the appearance of traditions. The Ashikaga shogunate continued to exist, but it was more a tribute to tradition than a real power capable of influencing the situation in the country. Each daimyo now felt like the rightful master in their province, their own shogun, creating their own laws, controlling lands, and forming armies ready to engage in battle at any moment. Unlike the past, when troops were assembled only for military campaigns, each clan now maintained permanent detachments of samurai, professional warriors ready for battle at any moment. Warriors no longer lived by the old principles based on loyalty and honor. They began to obey strength and benefit, forming alliances and betraying their allies depending on the circumstances. Loyalty began to be seen as a common transaction rather than a sacred duty, and betrayal became an integral part of the political game, in which no one could be sure that their ally would not become their worst enemy the next day. During this period, the largest and most influential houses began to strengthen, and they would later fight for dominance over all of Japan. However, the samurai were not the only ones who felt that the world had changed, and the old order was collapsing. While feudal lords waged endless wars for power and influence, monastic communities, supported by the common people, also began to gain strength, turning into a serious political and military force. The Jodo Shinshu movement, a school of Buddhism that enjoyed immense popularity among ordinary people, achieved the greatest influence. Unlike aristocratic Buddhism, which preached strict rituals and self-denial, Jodo Shinshu taught that salvation was possible for everyone, regardless of their social status or origin. This appealed to peasants, artisans, and impoverished samurai, all those who did not want to submit to the authority of the daimyo and accept the status quo. As the shogunate weakened, monastic communities, encouraged by their growing strength, began to refuse to pay taxes to feudal lords, and then began to form their own armies, consisting of armed monks and peasants. Thus, the Iko-Iki emerged, religious and political associations that built their own fortresses and fought on equal terms with the samurai, challenging the power of the daimyo. The most powerful center of the Iko-Iki became Hongan-ji, a Buddhist monastery that over several decades transformed into a real military citadel, capable of resisting even the strongest feudal lords. Now even religion had become part of the war, an instrument in the struggle for power and influence. Some daimyo, committed to old traditions, tried to maintain the existing order by forming alliances and playing a subtle diplomatic game, hoping to avoid bloodshed. But there were also those who saw new opportunities in the chaos and destruction, a chance to change their destiny and achieve power. These were people who did not wait idly by, but acted, took risks, and fought for their place in the sun. They understood that the era of aristocrats and officials was passing, and the fate of the country would now be decided by those who could win on the battlefield, demonstrating their strength and determination. So, we move on to the story of one of the greatest warlords of the Sengoku period, Takeda Shingen, a man whose name struck terror into the hearts of his enemies. West of Kyoto, among the rugged mountain ranges of Kai province, lay the land ruled by representatives of the mighty Takeda clan. It was a harsh land, poor in natural resources, but rich in warriors ready at any moment to defend their homeland. It was not a place for soft rulers accustomed to luxury and idleness, but only for those who had known how to handle a sword since childhood and were ready to bear the heavy burden of power, bearing responsibility for the fate of their clan. However, when young Takeda Shingen had to take the reins of power, he inherited a rather weak state, torn by internal contradictions and surrounded by enemies. By that time, the clan was fragmented by internal strife, caused by the struggle for power and influence. Vassals trusted themselves more than their lord, pursuing their own interests and unwilling to submit to his will, and treacherous neighbors, like predators, waited for the opportune moment to tear the lands of Kai apart, seizing choice pieces of territory and weakening the clan's influence. Shingen, possessing a sharp mind and strategic thinking, quickly realized that if he wanted to survive in this ruthless world, preserve his power, and ensure the prosperity of his clan, then he had to create a new army, develop a new strategy, and establish a new order based on discipline and efficiency. He began with the most important thing, carrying out radical reforms aimed at strengthening the army and increasing its combat effectiveness. Where other rulers blindly relied on outdated traditions and prejudices, he bet on efficiency and innovation, introducing new methods of warfare and increasing discipline in the troops. Before him, war in Japan was a traditional affair, subject to strict rules and rituals. Warriors gathered on the battlefield, exchanged challenges, and arranged ritual duels between the strongest warriors before the battle itself began. But Shingen, a pragmatic and calculating leader, despised the old customs, considering them ineffective and useless. In his eyes, there was no honor in losing. There was only victory or defeat, life or death. He believed that the main thing was victory, achieved by any means, and saw no point in observing outdated traditions that could prevent the achievement of this goal. Shingen's main weapon was the cavalry, a mobile and deadly force capable of inflicting a crushing blow on the enemy. While other daimyo used riders only as mobile detachments for reconnaissance and quick strikes, Shingen created an entire army based on cavalry, making it the main striking force of his troops. The blows of his cavalry were strong, precise, and swift, sweeping away everything in their path. Takeda's warriors did not wait for the enemy to line up in a beautiful battle formation, observing all the rituals. They rushed forward like a hurricane, tearing the enemy ranks to shreds, sowing panic and death. But war is not only a physical clash of armies, but also psychology, a game of the mind, in which the one who knows his enemy better and knows how to use his weaknesses wins. Shingen developed a principle that became his military creed and philosophy of life. Fast as the wind, quiet as the forest, fierce as fire, immovable as a mountain. These four qualities became the symbol of his tactics and strategy, defining his actions on the battlefield and in politics. Attack with lightning speed, not allowing the enemy to recover and prepare for defense. Defend by creating an impenetrable shield capable of withstanding any enemy onslaught. Suppress the enemy with ruthless force, leaving him not a single chance of victory. Wait until the enemy is tired and weakened, and only then deliver the decisive blow, finishing him off and depriving him of all hope of salvation. However, the path of a conqueror is rarely straight and easy. Soon, a worthy opponent appeared in Shingen's path, a man who was not inferior to him in courage, mind, or strategic thinking, Uesugi Kenshin, who became his main rival and enemy. Their clash became one of the most legendary and dramatic events in Japanese history, determining the course of the Sengoku era. If Takeda Shingen was the embodiment of strategy and calculation, a pragmatic and ruthless warrior, then Uesugi Kenshin became a symbol of honor and warrior spirit, an unwavering defender of justice and order. They were like two sides of the same coin, complementing each other, but at the same time irreconcilably hostile, and their fates could not but collide in a deadly battle. But before Kenshin became one of the most formidable and respected rulers of the Sengoku period, his path to power was full of trials, intrigues, and spiritual quests that tempered his character and shaped his worldview. Unlike most daimyo, who fought solely for power, wealth, and fame, Kenshin fought not only for these, but also for his principles, for his beliefs, for his ideals, which he placed above all else. The future lord of the northern lands, Uesugi Kenshin, was born in 1530 into a family where the struggle for power was commonplace, a habitual way of life. His real name was Nagao Kagetora. He was the fourth son of the head of the Nagao house, a vassal of the powerful Uesugi clan, and no one expected that he would ever come to power, inheriting his father's title and becoming the ruler of Echigo province. But fate, as it often happens, decreed otherwise, making its own adjustments to plans and expectations. When his older brother, the legitimate heir to the family title, turned out to be a weak and incompetent ruler, unable to effectively manage his lands and defend them from enemies, discontent began to arise among the vassals of the Nagao clan. Kagetora, who possessed a strong character and leadership qualities, initially did not aspire to the throne, preferring to engage in spiritual practices and martial arts, but seeing that his family could lose its influence and power due to the weakness of his brother, he accepted the challenge of fate, deciding to take matters into his own hands. In 1536, at the age of 33, he took up arms against his own brother, challenging his rule. A brief but fierce power struggle ended in his unconditional victory. Kagetora was recognized as the new head of the Nagao house, receiving the right to manage his lands and represent the interests of his clan. But this was not the end of it. Soon, the powerful Uesugi clan, which the Nagao served, itself found itself in a state of turmoil and chaos, having lost its leader. The ruler of the Uesugi clan died, leaving behind no worthy successor capable of continuing his work and preserving the unity of the clan. Kagetora, possessing a keen intuition and political talent, took advantage of the situation, seeing in it an opportunity to strengthen his influence and expand his possessions. He did not just join the struggle for power, but managed to lead the Uesugi clan, becoming its new leader and uniting numerous vassals under his command. He adopted a new name, Uesugi Kenshin, thereby consolidating his right to power and declaring his ambitions. Now he was the ruler of the powerful Echigo province, but with this title came new enemies, eager to overthrow him and dreaming of seizing his lands. From the first years of his reign, Kenshin showed that he was unlike other daimyo, that he was an extraordinary and unpredictable person, possessing his own code of honor and moral principles. He was a man of strict principles, deeply religious, ascetic, and unwavering in his adherence to his samurai code. Despite his immense power and influence, Kenshin never sought to conquer Kyoto or become shogun, dreaming of power over all of Japan. Unlike many other daimyo driven by a thirst for wealth and a desire for absolute power, he saw himself as a protector of justice and order, a guardian of traditions, and a fighter against chaos and lawlessness. He built fortresses, fortified cities, and protected trade routes, ensuring the safety and prosperity of his subjects. His rule in Echigo province was a model of stability and prosperity in an age of chaos and strife, an example for other rulers striving for peace and well-being in their lands. He believed he was a reincarnation of Bishamonten, the Buddhist god of war and justice, sent to earth to protect people from evil and establish order. His army fought not for the conquest of new lands or for enrichment, but to establish justice and order in a chaotic world, to protect the weak and oppressed from the tyranny of the strong and cruel. Unlike many other rulers, Kenshin did not wage wars of aggression without cause, attacking his neighbors to expand his domain. He intervened in conflicts when he saw blatant injustice, when the strong oppressed the weak, and honor and dignity were trampled upon. He always stood up for those who could not defend themselves, considering it his duty and destiny. But even such a noble and just ruler as Uesugi Kenshin had enemies who envied his power and sought his overthrow. And the most dangerous of them was already waiting for him, preparing for a deadly battle. Uesugi Kenshin and Takeda Shingen, two outstanding commanders of their era, seemed born to fight each other, to determine which of them was worthy to rule Japan. They stood on opposite sides of the battlefield, embodying two completely different approaches to war, two opposing philosophies. One was a calculating strategist, skillfully using the resource superiority and strict discipline of his troops to win victories over his enemies. The other was a brave and noble warrior, for whom battle was not just a way to achieve power, but a manifestation of the highest will, a test of spirit and valor, an opportunity to prove his honor and devotion to his ideals. Between their domains lay Shinano Province, a strategically important region, control of which meant virtual power over all of northern Japan. And both rulers were ready to fight for this province at any cost, stopping at nothing to achieve their goal. Thus began one of the greatest and most bloody wars in the history of Japan, a series of 5 battles at Kawanakajima, which stretched for 11 long years, becoming a symbol of their irreconcilable feud and military genius. The Kawanakajima Valley, located between the domains of Takeda and Uesugi, became the site of their deadly confrontation, the arena in which the fate of not only these two clans, but also of all of northern Japan, was decided. The battles that took place here turned into a grand test of will and tactics, in which both sides sought not just victory, but absolute superiority over their opponent, striving to destroy his army and seize his lands. Both commanders carefully studied each other, trying to anticipate the opponent's moves, unravel his strategy, and exploit his weaknesses for their own purposes. They employed various tactical techniques such as feigned retreats, ambushes, espionage, and even psychological warfare to demoralize the enemy and sow panic in their ranks. But despite 5 major clashes, neither was able to achieve a decisive victory over the other, destroying his army and seizing his lands. The first clash between the armies of Takeda and Uesugi occurred when Uesugi Kenshin, at the head of his troops, descended into Shinano Province, seeking to prevent Takeda from gaining a foothold in the region and establishing control over it. It was a kind of reconnaissance in force, a tactical game in which both sides had not yet revealed all their cards, assessing the enemy's strengths and identifying his weaknesses. Shogun, as an experienced strategist, waited, not hurrying to engage in open combat, while Kenshin probed the enemy's defenses, trying to find a breach in them. The troops maneuvered across the terrain, avoiding direct clashes and seeking to occupy more advantageous positions. It was a chess game in which both commanders, like grandmasters, looked for a weakness in the enemy's defense in order to deliver a decisive blow. As a result of this clash, neither side achieved a real victory. Both leaders withdrew their troops, preparing for the next step, for the next battle, which was to determine the outcome of the war. 2 years later, Shogun again sent his troops into Shinano Province, intending to gain a foothold in the region and establish control over it. Kenshin, knowing that he would not be able to take the enemy by force in open combat, decided to use the tactic of a feigned retreat to lure the Takeda army into a trap and destroy it. He left part of his positions undefended, creating the appearance that his army was retreating under the onslaught of the enemy, hoping to lure the enemy into a pre-prepared ambush. Shogun, believing that the enemy was fleeing, abandoning his positions, moved forward to pursue the retreating troops, but suddenly encountered a prepared counterattack, which fell upon him with all its might. The battle was fierce and bloody, but again did not bring a decisive outcome to either side. Shogun retreated to regroup his forces, and Kenshin did not pursue him, knowing that this war was only beginning and there were many battles ahead. Now the war has turned not only into a physical, but also into an intellectual confrontation, a game of the mind, in which the one who can outwit his opponent and make him make a fatal mistake will win. Shogun, in order to mislead the enemy and misinform him, ordered his people to spread rumors that his army was weakened and demoralized, that the soldiers were tired of the war and ready to desert. Kenshin, believing these rumors, gathered his troops, hoping to inflict a crushing blow on the enemy and win a final victory. However, when he approached the enemy camp, it turned out to be an ambush, skillfully prepared by Shogun. Both commanders parted again without a decisive victory, but now they respected each other even more, realizing that they were dealing with a worthy and dangerous opponent. The fourth battle of Kawanakajima became the culmination of the entire war, the bloodiest and most fierce clash between the armies of Takeda and Uesugi. Kenshin led 20,000 warriors, determined to strike a deadly blow against the enemy and achieve a final victory in this protracted war. Shogun, knowing that he could not withstand a frontal attack by superior enemy forces, built his army into a complex system of echelons where advanced detachments could quickly retreat behind defensive lines covered by archers and spearmen, creating a deadly zone for advancing enemies. But Kenshin, contrary to Shogun's expectations, did not hesitate and wait. His troops attacked at dawn, catching the Takeda army by surprise and disrupting its battle order. A fierce and bloody battle began, in which every meter of land was paid for in blood, where warriors fought with desperate fury, sparing neither themselves nor their enemies. It was in this battle that the legendary clash of the two great leaders took place, becoming a symbol of their irreconcilable feud and military genius. Uesugi Kenshin, despite the fact that his army was inferior in number to the heavy cavalry of Takeda Shogun, understood that he had a chance of victory if he could catch the enemy by surprise and act unexpectedly. He ordered the attack to begin at dawn, when the first rays of the sun had not yet managed to break through the morning haze enveloping the battlefield. His men moved swiftly, like shadows, appearing from the fog and falling on the enemy like a bolt from the blue. Shogun's warriors, who had not yet fully awakened and prepared for battle, were caught off guard by the sudden attack. The Takeda cavalry, accustomed to organized maneuvers and clear commands, did not have time to regroup and take their positions, encountering the fierce onslaught of Kenshin's samurai, who broke through the first lines of defense, cutting through the ranks of archers and pushing the spearmen aside, opening the way to the heart of the Takeda camp. The battle is raging in the very middle of the camp, around Shogun's headquarters, where his closest advisors are frantically trying to understand what is happening and how to stop the enemy's advance. Kenshin, not wasting a second, led his personal detachment and led it into the very heart of the camp, breaking through the ranks of enemies like a storm sweeping everything in its path. He moved with incredible speed, not lingering in battles. His people, inspired by his fearlessness, cut their way straight to Takeda's tent, clearing the way for him. The enemies, stunned by the sudden attack, fell one after another, not even realizing that the ruler of Echigo himself, the legendary Uesugi Kenshin, whom they considered invincible, was in front of them. And now before him appears the tent, in which, as he knew, was his main enemy, Takeda Shogun, who ruled the fates of his army. Shogun was not on the battlefield, did not command his troops, but sat on a tatami, watching the disposition of his forces and developing a strategy for further actions. Everything happened in a matter of seconds, a blink of an eye that decided the outcome of the battle. Kenshin, like an enraged god, drove straight into the tent and with a swing raised his sword, preparing to deliver a mortal blow. Shogun, who possessed lightning-fast reactions and instincts honed by years of battles, did not panic or lose his composure. He understood that he would not have time to grab his weapon, that there was too little time left to defend himself. But his instincts did not fail him, suggesting the only correct solution. He instantly raised his folding war fan, made of durable steel and designed for protection, and deflected the first blow aimed at his head. The steel of the sword met the metal of the fan with a loud clang. Sparks flew in all directions. Kenshin, not giving the enemy a chance to recover, struck several more blows, showering Shogun with a hail of steel, but Shogun, demonstrating amazing composure and skill, skillfully defended himself, repelling each blow with incredible precision and speed. In that instant, Shogun's bodyguards, jolted back to reality, threw themselves in front of their lord, forming an impenetrable shield and pushing Kenshin away from the command tent. Realizing that the opportunity was lost, that he would not be able to kill Shogun, and that he risked being surrounded and destroyed, Kenshin retreated before he could be cut off from his own troops. The Takeda forces, recovering from the surprise attack, launched a counter-offensive, forcing the Uesugi army to withdraw back across the river, abandoning the battlefield. After this battle, no one could say with certainty who had emerged victorious and who had suffered defeat. Both armies had sustained immense losses, with thousands dead on each side, but neither had achieved a decisive breakthrough, failing to crush the enemy army or seize their lands. This final fifth battle of Kawanakajima was not as bloody or ferocious as the fourth, but it became the ultimate test of tactics and strategy, a trial of willpower and spirit for both warlords. This time, Shogun, realizing that his army was too vulnerable to Kenshin's frontal assaults, employed a tactic of feigned positions to lure his opponent into a trap and destroy him. He left a portion of his troops in plain sight, displaying his strength and readiness for battle, while he concealed the bulk of his forces behind the hills, preparing to deliver a sudden blow from the flanks. When Kenshin's army, believing that they faced the main enemy force, attacked the exposed positions, they were met with a powerful counterattack from the flanks, unleashed by the main Takeda forces hidden behind the hills. But once again, there was no conclusive victory. Neither side was able to gain a decisive advantage. Both armies, having suffered heavy casualties, once again disengaged, understanding that neither could annihilate the other without catastrophic losses, without weakening their own strength and undermining their own power. After the fifth battle of Kawanakajima, the Takeda and the Uesugi no longer engaged in direct warfare, no longer clashed in open battle. Their rivalry continued, but it took the form of sieges of fortresses, political maneuvering, and skirmishes between vassal armies, rather than direct confrontations between the main forces. They respected each other as worthy adversaries, understanding that they were dealing with a strong and intelligent foe. When Takeda Shogun died, Uesugi Kenshin, to the surprise of many, even mourned his passing, expressing his regret at the loss. He understood that he had lost not just an enemy, but the only worthy opponent who had forced him to be better, to hone his skills, and to sharpen his mind. Thus ended the greatest military rivalry of the Sengoku era, entering history as an example of tactical brilliance, iron will, unyielding spirit, and samurai honor. It brought victory to neither of its participants, but left an indelible mark on Japanese history, inspiring generations of warriors and commanders. While the Takeda and the Uesugi, consumed by their war, were losing thousands of warriors in their exhausting and bloody battles, trying to wrest every inch of land from each other, a completely different threat was growing in southeastern Japan, one that few knew about. While the northern daimyo were locked in an endless struggle for a balance of power, striving to maintain their influence and prevent their neighbors from growing stronger. In the Tokai region, a man emerged who did not want to fight for individual provinces, wasting his strength and resources on pointless wars. He wanted to conquer the entire country at once, uniting it under his rule and establishing a new order. This man was Imagawa Yoshimoto, an ambitious daimyo who dreamed of becoming the ruler of all Japan. He was the heir to one of the most powerful and influential aristocratic dynasties in Japan, the Imagawa clan, which had deep roots and a rich history. Unlike most samurai clans, who seized power through military means by force of arms, the Imagawa clan had deep roots dating back centuries and held high positions in the shogunate, wielding immense influence and wealth. Yoshimoto himself received the finest education of his time, studying with the best teachers and mentors. He studied strategy and tactics of warfare, poetry and calligraphy, absorbing the wisdom of Chinese classics and Japanese history. From childhood, he was instilled with the belief that he was not just a warrior, not just the head of a clan, but a man born to rule, chosen by destiny to lead the country and bring it to prosperity. And he believed it, convinced of his destiny and his exceptionalism. When Yoshimoto inherited power in the clan, his domains were in relatively good order. prosperous and respected by their neighbors. His land was rich and fertile, his vassals were loyal and devoted to their lord, and his neighbors seemed to pose no serious threat, fearing the strength and influence of the Imagawa clan. But it was not enough for him to simply be a strong daimyo, a respected ruler controlling his lands. He saw that the country was torn apart, fragmented into many warring clans, constantly fighting each other. He knew that the shogunate had lost its power, that the emperor was merely a puppet in the hands of powerful daimyo, and he understood that if someone could take the capital, Kyoto, under their control, they could proclaim themselves the true ruler of Japan, uniting the country under their banner. He conceived a grand campaign to Kyoto to overthrow the shogunate, establish his rule, and become the new ruler of Japan. In 1559, he began to assemble a massive army, preparing for his triumphant march on the capital. Under his command were more than 40,000 warriors, one of the largest and best-armed armies of the time, representing a formidable force. He fortified his rear, established a supply system, provided the army with horses and baggage trains, and developed a detailed campaign plan that took into account all possible difficulties and obstacles. Everything indicated that he, Imagawa Yoshimoto, could become the man who would unite Japan under his rule and put an end to the age of warring provinces. But in this story, there is one important nuance, one small detail that ultimately played a fateful role in the destiny of Imagawa Yoshimoto. His path to Kyoto led through the domains of a minor but ambitious daimyo, about whom few knew, but who was destined to play a key role in the history of Japan. This daimyo was named Oda Nobunaga, and his name meant little to most Japanese at the time, but in the future he was destined to change the fate of the entire country, becoming one of the most outstanding and influential rulers in its history. From his earliest days, Oda Nobunaga, almost deliberately, seemed to those around him like a person who could never become a true leader, a worthy head of his clan. In an era when samurai were raised in strict traditions of discipline, respect, and adherence to rituals, he effortlessly shattered all expectations, disregarding established norms and rules. He might arrive at official ceremonies in simple, casual clothes, indistinguishable from those of a peasant, eat like a common farmer without observing etiquette, suddenly disappear from the palace for an entire day to spend time among village children, playing with them and teaching them martial arts, or engage in chaotic training without adhering to any established rules. He ridiculed teachers, despised the tea ceremony, considering it a waste of time, organized chaotic contests between his vassals, testing them not so much in martial arts as in the ability to think outside the box, find original solutions, and quickly adapt to changing circumstances. The elders of his clan looked at him with condemnation, considering him a disgrace to the family. The vassals whispered behind his back, discussing his strange behavior, and some even openly said that this young man could never become a worthy ruler, and that he would shame the name of the Oda clan. But none of them noticed that behind this seeming foolishness and frivolity lay a sharp mind and cold calculation, that Nobunaga was much smarter and more insightful than they thought. Nobunaga saw what others did not understand. He realized that the old world was collapsing, that the traditions and customs that had defined the life of Japanese society for centuries could no longer contain the chaos of the era, that the time for change and new approaches had come. While other young heirs of noble families diligently memorized poems and honed rituals, preparing for their future roles, he thought about how to win in a war where the old rules no longer applied, how to create an army capable of defeating any enemy, and how to unite Japan under his rule. When his father, Oda Nobuhide, died in 1549, many hoped that this event would change the heir's behavior, force him to settle down and become more responsible. Now that he had become the head of the family, he had to behave like a ruler, observe mourning, obey the advice of his elders, and show respect for his deceased parent. But instead, he arrived at the funeral in simple, everyday clothes, not even bothering to wear the ceremonial sword, the symbol of his status and power. When it was time to perform the ritual offering, he silently took a handful of ashes from the urn containing his father's remains and threw them onto the altar, then simply turned and left, without saying a word. At that moment, panic erupted among the clan elders. They were shocked and outraged by his behavior. Some considered it madness, a sign of mental disorder. Others, sacrilege, an insult to the memory of his deceased father. They thought it was a clear sign that Nobunaga was incapable of ruling, that he was not worthy of being the head of the Oda family, and that he would lead the clan to ruin. They decided that something had to be done to change the heir, to force him to behave appropriately. Some of his advisors, secretly conspiring among themselves, began to support his younger brother, Oda Nobuyuki, hoping that he would be a more docile and manageable leader, that he would listen to their advice and follow their instructions. The vassals split into two camps, supporting different contenders for power, and the brothers, who had previously been friends, turned into enemies, willing to do anything to achieve their goals. In any other family, such a conflict would have led to lengthy and exhausting negotiations, compromises, and a potential division of power. However, Nobunaga had no intention of wasting time on idle chatter and political intrigues. He feigned ignorance, allowing the conspirators to relax and feel secure, pretending he was not interested in power and was willing to concede it to his brother. And when they felt completely safe and confident in their victory, he crushed them in a single night, delivering a sudden and devastating blow. His enemies barely had time to realize what was happening, as Nobunaga ordered the arrest and execution of all the rebels, leaving no one a chance to escape. He personally beheaded some of them in the public square, demonstrating his strength and resolve. Others he sent to the dungeons, leaving them to die slowly from hunger and thirst, to instill fear in anyone who even considered opposing him. He showed no mercy to his enemies, being ruthless and cruel so that no one would doubt his authority. His younger brother, Nobuyuki, humbly begged for forgiveness, admitting his guilt and pleading for mercy, and Nobunaga, to the surprise of many, pardoned him, sparing his life. But not because he felt any brotherly affection or pity, but because the time was not yet right to strike the final blow, because he had not yet achieved all his goals. Years later, when Nobuyuki once again attempted to rise against him, seeking revenge for his humiliation and to seize power, Nobunaga, without hesitating for a second, finally finished him off, destroying all his allies and cutting off all his support. After this victory, his authority within the clan became undeniable. No one dared question his power or challenge his decisions anymore. Now, no one doubted that he could and would rule, that he was the only worthy leader of the Oda clan. He had not simply suppressed the conspiracy, but had done so with such brutality and efficiency that the remaining vassals did not even attempt to challenge his authority, fearing they would share the rebels' fate. But this was only the first victory on the path to his grand ambition, just a small step toward the unification of Japan. The Oda clan controlled a tiny principality in Owari province, and many powerful neighbors did not take him seriously, regarding him as a lucky upstart, a minor daimyo who posed no real threat to their power and influence. Nobunaga understood that if he wanted to survive in this brutal world, he needed to change the very way war was waged, devising new strategies and tactics that would allow him to achieve victories over stronger and more numerous enemies. His enemies were slow, bound by sieges, and fought using traditional methods that were already outdated and ineffective. They would gather an army, form alliances, negotiate joint actions, and declare war in advance, adhering to established rules and customs. This was honorable, but not effective, giving Nobunaga an advantage that he could exploit for his own purposes. Nobunaga scornfully dismissed samurai chivalry, considering it obsolete and inefficient. He attacked suddenly, without declaring war, when his enemies least expected it, denying them the opportunity to prepare a defense. His men used firearms, which conservative commanders considered dishonorable and unworthy of a samurai, but Nobunaga understood that in war, all means were justified if they helped achieve victory. He hired commoners and peasants, training them in warfare and turning them into disciplined and effective soldiers, instead of relying solely on samurai units, which he considered too expensive and not always reliable. He gave his enemies no time to prepare, never allowing them to gather their strength, always striking first, delivering a devastating blow and depriving them of any chance to resist. But it was one thing to wage war against scattered and weak neighbors who were easy to defeat, and quite another to confront a true predator, a strong and experienced enemy seeking power. Nobunaga was rapidly expanding his influence, seizing new lands and subjugating neighboring clans. But suddenly, on his borders, appeared a man who was seriously intent on capturing Kyoto and becoming the overlord of all Japan. This man had a mighty army, numerous allies, and was confident of his victory, believing that no one could stop him. The summer of 1560 was unusually hot. The scorching sun scorched the land, turning the fields into a lifeless desert. The roads of Owari province were covered with a thick layer of dust. The rivers ran shallow, exposing their rocky beds, and the peasants looked towards the east with anxiety, fearing the impending calamity. There, in the distance, like an approaching storm, moved a vast army, ready to sweep away everything in its path. Imagawa Yoshimoto, confident in his victory, was marching towards Kyoto to seize power and become the ruler of Japan. He had gathered 40,000 warriors under his banner, battle-hardened and ready to carry out his every command. Samurai in heavy armor, spearmen, archers and horsemen encased in steel represented a formidable force, capable of crushing any enemy. His army had never known defeat. Cities surrendered to him without a fight, fearing his wrath. He saw in this not merely the conquest of new lands, but a triumphal march to glory, destined for him by fate. All that stood in his way was the small Oda clan, which owned a tiny principality and posed no serious threat. A clan ruled by a young and unknown warlord whose name meant little at this time. In his domain, he could barely muster 3,000 warriors, which was a drop in the bucket compared to Imagawa's vast army. To Imagawa's army, it was not a goal, but merely an annoying formality, a minor obstacle on the way to conquering Japan. Soon, he would celebrate his triumph in Kyoto, sitting on the shogun's throne, and Owari province would become merely an insignificant part of his domains, just another trophy in his collection. When news of the massive Imagawa army's advance reached Nobunaga's castle, turmoil and panic erupted among his advisors. Each suggested his own plan for survival, fearing Nobunaga's wrath. Some proposed hiding behind the strong walls of the castle and waiting for the enemy to tire of the siege, lose their strength, and retreat, leaving them in peace. Others advised fleeing, abandoning their lands and their people, gathering allies, and seeking support from other clans to resist the formidable enemy together. But Oda Nobunaga, to the surprise of his advisors, had no intention of hiding, running, or asking for help from others. He understood that traditional methods of warfare would avail him nothing, that he could not defeat Imagawa's army in open battle. Defense would only postpone the inevitable defeat. Negotiations would lead to submission and humiliation, and flight would put an end to his future, depriving him of any hope of power and glory. He decided to act in a way that no one expected, using cunning and deception to lure the enemy into a trap and destroy them. He ordered his men to spread rumors that he was preparing to surrender, that he was ready to submit to the mercy of the victor and recognize Imagawa's authority. The castles opened their gates. White flags fluttered over the towers, creating the illusion of imminent submission to lull the enemy's vigilance and conceal his true intentions. Imagawa's warriors, confident of their victory, moved on without fear of ambush or resistance, certain that they were in for an easy stroll to Kyoto. Meanwhile, Nobunaga and his loyal warriors were already preparing a devastating blow, devising a daring plan that would turn the tide of the war and bring him victory. In the evening, a fierce storm broke out over the Okehazama Valley, as if nature itself had decided to intervene in the course of events. The sky became overcast with dark clouds. Thunder rumbled across Imagawa's camp, shaking the ground, and torrential rain lashed the warriors' faces, blurring their vision. The warriors were resting after a long march, celebrating the upcoming triumph and telling each other that they would be in Kyoto tomorrow, sitting on the shogun's throne. But while they drank sake and laughed, unaware of the danger, Nobunaga's unit, hidden in the darkness, made its way through the forests, approaching the enemy's camp. The rain muffled footsteps, the wind concealed whispers, and the thunderstorm rendered Imagawa's camp defenseless, preventing the sentries from noticing the enemy's approach in time. When lightning illuminated the sky, shadows in armor flickered among the trees, like the spirits of dead warriors come to avenge their demise. Nobunaga, having waited for the opportune moment, gave the order to attack, and his warriors, like arrows released from a bow, rushed at the enemy's camp. At night, Imagawa's camp became a field of slaughter, engulfed in chaos and panic. The Oda warriors, like demons unleashed from hell, gave the enemies no time to regroup and did not allow them to organize a defense. They burst into tents, smashing them to splinters with their swords, set fire to the pavilions, creating a fiery inferno, and cut down the sentries, leaving them no chance of escape. Imagawa's army, which had recently considered itself invincible, awoke in chaos and terror, gripped by panic and confusion. The samurai tried to grab their weapons to defend themselves, but there was no familiar battlefield in front of them where they could line up and engage in organized combat. They stumbled over fallen poles, fell into the mud, drowned in the darkness, not understanding what was happening as Nobunaga's horsemen broke through to the very heart of the camp, sowing death and destruction. The enemies fled in panic, trying to escape from imminent death. For the first time in many years, Imagawa's army learned what fear was, what defeat was, what death was. At that moment, Imagawa Yoshimoto himself had not yet realized that the battle was already lost, that his dream of conquering Japan had been shattered to pieces. In his tent, he was calmly drinking tea, enjoying the peace and quiet, waiting for dawn when he could continue his triumphal march on Kyoto. He was told that there was noise in the camp, but he did not pay attention to it, deciding that it was only a minor skirmish, not worthy of his attention. Only when two of Oda's samurai, their faces distorted with rage, burst into his tent, did he realize that his army had been destroyed, that his plan had failed, and that imminent death awaited him. He seized his sword to defend himself, but he was too slow and clumsy to even make a single strike. The first blade pierced his chest, puncturing his heart, and the second severed his head from his shoulders. In the mud, under the pouring rain, lay the man who had dreamed of becoming the ruler of Japan, whose ambitions had proven far too great, and his strength far too little. When the battle ended, the Imagawa camp had ceased to exist, reduced to a pile of charred ruins strewn with corpses. Those who had failed to flee the battlefield were mercilessly slaughtered, leaving no one alive. The army that was supposed to conquer Kyoto and establish a new order in Japan was wiped from the face of the earth as if it had never existed. On this day, a new star rose on the Japanese horizon. A new military genius emerged, capable of changing the course of history. Oda Nobunaga, a previously little-known daimyo, had won a brilliant victory, crushing an army that outnumbered his forces tenfold, demonstrating his talent as a commander and his innovative approach to warfare. As the dust settled after the Battle of Okehazama, and the mutilated body of Imagawa Yoshimoto remained lying in the mud under the pouring rain, as if forgotten by the gods, the fate of Japan took another unexpected turn, shaping its future history. Oda Nobunaga announced himself as a new leader to be reckoned with, a force capable of changing the balance of power in the country. But among those who observed this shift and assessed its consequences, there was one man for whom this battle opened up a completely different path, providing a unique opportunity to change his life and the fate of Japan. On that day, he was on the other side of the barricades, under the banners of the Imagawa clan, forced to serve his enemies. His name did not yet inspire fear in anyone. No one knew about his plans and ambitions. In the eyes of those around him, he was merely a hostage, a prisoner, a person who did not belong to himself and could not make his own decisions. But it was he, this inconspicuous man, who would complete the era of chaos and unite Japan, creating a new dynasty that would rule the country for centuries. This man's name was Ieyasu Tokugawa. In an era when power was measured in swords and concluded alliances, being born into a noble family did not necessarily mean freedom and independence. On the contrary, it often meant living as a hostage, a pawn in a political game, deprived of the right to choose and the ability to control one's own destiny. The boy, who would later be called the creator of the great dynasty, who united Japan and established peace and prosperity in the country, was born in 1543 into the family of a minor daimyo of Mikawa province, whose clan did not possess enough strength or influence to independently defend its interests. His Tokugawa clan was too small to fight on equal terms with powerful neighbors, but important enough to be valuable as a political tool. When he was only 6 years old, his father, weakened by the constant struggle between powerful neighbors, was forced to give his son as a hostage to the Imagawa clan to guarantee his loyalty and avoid war. It was not a gesture of goodwill, not a demonstration of friendship, but a harsh necessity, a guarantee of loyalty, a price for peace. If his family dared to betray the Imagawa, tried to change their alliance or oppose them, the boy would be immediately killed, becoming a victim of political intrigues and internecine warfare. Thus began his life in captivity, far from home and loved ones. He grew up far from home, deprived of freedom and the right to make his own decisions, unable to influence his fate. Every day he saw how his guardians treated him not as a person, but as an instrument, as a pawn in a political game that could be used in the future to strengthen power and achieve their goals. He could observe the art of war, listen to the conversations of military leaders, study politics and strategy, but he could not choose his own side, he could not express his opinion, and he had to obey the will of those who held him in chains. As he grew older, he was forced to marry a girl from the Imagawa clan, to further bind him to this dynasty, making him part of their family and depriving him of the opportunity to change his alliance. He remained in the shadows, forced to serve those who held him in chains, hiding his true feelings and intentions. But when thunder rumbled over the field of Okahazama, and Nobunaga burned the Imagawa camp and tore his army to shreds, Ieyasu realized that now his life depended on the right choice, that the time had come to act. When news of the crushing defeat of the Imagawa reached the castles where the vassals of this clan were located, panic and chaos began, everyone trying to escape and avoid the wrath of the victor. Many commanders fled, abandoning their troops and their lands to their fate. Cities revolted, seeking to free themselves from the power of the Imagawa, and old enemies emerged from their hiding places, eager to avenge past grievances. But Ieyasu had only one question that he asked himself again and again. To whom should he now join? Which side should he choose in order to survive and maintain his power? He knew that he could try to regain his independence, free himself from the power of the Imagawa, and create his own state. He could try to gather the forces of his clan, reclaim the lands of Mikawa, but he did not have enough resources to stand alone, to resist the onslaught of stronger neighbors. At this moment, a messenger arrived from Oda Nobunaga, the victor of Okahazama, offering him an alliance and protection. Instead of destroying Ieyasu, as many other daimyo would have done, Nobunaga offered him a new path, an opportunity to change his destiny and become an influential ruler. He did not see him as an enemy, but rather as a person who could be useful in his struggle to unite Japan. Ieyasu was not stupid. He was a cunning and calculating politician, capable of assessing the situation and making the right decision. He understood that Oda was the future ruler, who had already proven his strength and his talent, who was not afraid of either the numerical superiority of the enemy or the outdated traditional rules of war. He made a decision that would determine his entire future destiny, a decision that would lead him to power and glory. He severed all ties with the Imagawa family, sided with Nobunaga, and for the first time in his life became the master of his own destiny, gaining the opportunity to make his own decisions and determine his own path. Now he was no longer a hostage, no longer a prisoner. He was an ally, an equal among equals. He returned to Mikawa not as an exile, not as a fugitive, but as its ruler, as a man destined to become great. But his position was fragile, his power precarious. Many vassals considered him a traitor who had betrayed his lord and looked upon him as a former prisoner who could not become a strong leader and protect their lands. But he was no longer the timid boy who could be cornered and forced to obey. He began to cleanse his domains of enemies and traitors, strengthening his power and winning the trust of his subjects. Those who questioned his authority, who did not recognize him as the rightful ruler, he destroyed without mercy, leaving them no chance of resistance. Those who doubted his strength and leadership qualities, he convinced by force, demonstrating his determination and cruelty. He entrenched himself in his lands, turning them into an impregnable fortress, ready to withstand any onslaught of enemies, and began to prepare for future battles, for a long and difficult struggle to unite Japan. The vassals now saw in him not the timid boy who had grown up in captivity and deprived of his own will, but a wise and far-sighted ruler who had managed to find his way to power, showing cunning, determination, and talent as a politician. But even then, at the very beginning of his reign, he knew that if he was patient, if he carefully studied his enemies and allies, analyzing their strengths and weaknesses, and waited for the right moment, then one day he would become the one who would end the Sengoku era and unite the country under his rule, establishing peace and prosperity. By 1575, Oda Nobunaga's power had greatly strengthened, his influence had spread to many provinces, and his army had become one of the strongest and most combat-ready in Japan. But he still had to fight those who clung to the old order, who did not want to recognize his authority, and who sought to preserve outdated traditions and customs. There were still clans in Japan who believed that war was primarily a matter of personal valor, courage, and swordsmanship, and not discipline, tactics, and strategic thinking. Among such enemies was Takeda Katsuyori, the son of the legendary Takeda Shogun, who inherited from his father not only his lands and his title, but also his ambitions and his warlike spirit. He inherited from his father the best cavalry in the country, consisting of hardened samurai who had spent decades sweeping enemies away with crushing, swift attacks, striking fear into the whole of Japan. Katsuyori was confident that no army could withstand the power of his horsemen, that his cavalry was invincible, and he was going to prove it by defeating the army of Oda Nobunaga and destroying the garrison of Nagashino Castle, which belonged to one of his allies. In the spring of 1575, Takeda's troops invaded Mikawa province and besieged the fortress, which was under the control of Okudaira Sadamasa, one of Tokugawa Ieyasu's closest associates, a loyal vassal. Inside the walls remained only 500 defenders, opposing 15,000 Takeda warriors, outnumbering them 30-1. The besieged understood that they could not stand alone, that their inevitable death awaited them, but they believed in their lord, knew that help had already been sent, and hoped that it would arrive in time. One of the warriors, risking his life, managed to break through the ranks of the enemies and reach Tokugawa Ieyasu, informing him of the critical situation and asking for help. Ieyasu, understanding that the loss of Nagashino Castle would be a serious blow to his influence and undermine his authority, immediately turned to Oda Nobunaga, his powerful ally, for support. He not only agreed to save the castle, but also decided that this would be the perfect moment to destroy the Takeda army once and for all, to deprive them of the opportunity to threaten his possessions and put an end to their ambitions. Nobunaga advanced with a massive army numbering 38,000 soldiers, but he wasn't planning to simply engage in open battle, relying solely on numerical superiority. He personally chose the battlefield, meticulously studying the terrain to select the most advantageous position for his forces. He chose the plain near the Rengagawa River, located several kilometers from Nagashino Castle, which was ideally suited for his tactics. Here, he ordered the construction of defensive fortifications, wooden barricades and stockades, designed to slow down the enemy cavalry, preventing them from building up speed and delivering a devastating blow. However, his primary weapon was the arquebusiers, soldiers armed with firearms, who were tasked with overwhelming the enemy with a hail of gunfire. He deployed 3,000 soldiers with arquebuses, arranging them in 3 lines to provide continuous fire on the advancing enemy. The first line would fire, then retreat to reload, while the second line opened fire, followed by the third, creating an uninterrupted wall of fire. This constant barrage of bullets gave the enemy no respite, preventing them from getting close to the fortifications. As Nobunaga's army took their positions, preparing for battle, Takeda Katsuyori did not retreat. He was not intimidated by the firearms, and he did not abandon his plans. He knew that guns fired slowly and reloading took time, and he believed that his brave samurai would break through the barrage and crush Nobunaga's soldiers in close combat, proving their superiority. He led his renowned cavalry, the pride of his clan, into the attack. Thousands of horsemen, clad in armor, surged forward, driven by war cries and the sounds of drums, determined to crush the enemy. They were confident in their victory, believing in their invincibility and expecting to sweep aside any infantry as their fathers and grandfathers had done before them. But as soon as they approached Nobunaga's positions, they were met with the first volley, which crashed down on them like thunder out of a clear sky. The foremost riders plummeted from their horses, struck down by bullets, their bodies left lying on the ground, while their mounts bolted away, crazed with fear. But the attack did not falter. Despite the losses, the cavalry continued to advance, heedless of their falling comrades. As the first line of arquebusiers retreated to reload, the second line took over, unleashing a fresh barrage of fire on the enemy. Then, as the second line retreated, the third opened fire, creating a continuous wall of fire that gave the enemy no chance of survival. The samurai never even made it to the fortifications. They perished on the approaches under the relentless fire, falling from their horses and lying on the ground like felled trees. Only a few managed to reach the barricades, but there they were met by spearmen, ready to repel any attack. The entire attack faltered, drowning in blood and pain, and Takeda's best warriors perished, never able to prove their superiority. When the battle was over, the field was strewn with the bodies of fallen warriors, the blood mixed with the mud, creating a ghastly tableau of death and destruction. The Takeda army had lost thousands of men, the flower of its cavalry, its finest strength. His celebrated cavalry, the pride of his clan, no longer existed as a formidable force capable of crushing any foe. Katsuyori, shaken by what he had witnessed, retreated with the remnants of his army, realizing that he had suffered a crushing defeat, one that would prove a fatal blow to his clan. Over the next few years, the remnants of his forces were wiped out, and he himself was forced to commit suicide to avoid shame and capture. However, the consequences of this battle were far more significant than just the defeat of one clan, however powerful it may have been. On that day, in the valley of Nagashino, the very concept of samurai warfare, based on personal valor and swordsmanship, died. For centuries, the decisive factor in battles had been the personal courage, strength, and agility of the warrior, his skill with weapons, and his ferocity in attack. Now, victory was achieved through tactics, discipline, the skillful use of firearms, and cold calculation. Firearms had demonstrated their effectiveness and proven that it did not matter how skilled a warrior was with a katana, how strong and brave he was, if he could not reach the enemy before a bullet struck him down. Oda Nobunaga realized that the future belonged not to those who wielded swords, but to those who could think strategically, who could skillfully utilize new technologies, and who could organize their army as a well-oiled machine. After Nagashino, he completely restructured his army, abandoning the traditional samurai style of warfare based on personal valor and individual skill. Now, each soldier was part of a single mechanism, working in concert and performing their functions, where there was no room for chaotic attacks, personal samurai glory, or individual initiative. This was a turning point, when warfare in Japan ceased to be an art of individual combat and became a precise science, requiring strategic thinking, discipline, and organization. Warfare was now waged not with valor, but with tactics, not with strength, but with intelligence, not with courage, but with calculation. After the Battle of Nagashino, Oda Nobunaga firmly established himself as the dominant military force in Japan, his power and influence steadily growing, and his army becoming the strongest and most battle-ready in the country. He had proven that discipline and firearms were stronger than the samurai spirit, that a well-organized and armed army could defeat any enemy, and he continued to build a system in which all power should belong to him, where he was to become the sole ruler of Japan. But even after many famous warlords became his vassals, recognizing his authority and swearing allegiance to him, and his warriors marched through the conquered provinces, striking terror into his enemies and demonstrating the strength of his army, his power remained incomplete, remaining only a shell, inside of which hid powerful forces that had ruled the country from the shadows for centuries, exerting enormous influence on the politics and economy of Japan. Among these forces, the most dangerous and irreconcilable adversary were the Buddhist monasteries, possessing vast wealth, influence, and military might. They existed not merely as centers of religion, where people could find solace and salvation, but as veritable political and military organizations, interfering in state affairs and influencing the country's policies. For centuries, they had enjoyed independence, forging alliances with samurai, launching uprisings, and weaving intrigues, and their leaders often wielded immense power, surpassing that of many daimyo. The warrior monks, known as Sohei, were among the most skilled and well-trained fighters in the country, prepared to fight for their faith to the last drop of blood. They wielded naginatas, swords, bows, and other weapons, and fought with the same discipline, courage, and skill as the samurai, second to none in the martial arts. The warrior monks did not recognize the shogunate, did not submit to the daimyo, and were certainly not going to bow down to a man whom they considered a destroyer of traditions, a blasphemer, and a usurper. For Nobunaga, this meant only one thing, that their existence was incompatible with his future Japan, that he must destroy their power and subject them to his will. When Nobunaga entered Kyoto in 1568, he did so not only for power and control over the country. Kyoto was a symbol of the old order, a center of power and culture, and its streets were lined with temples, and monks ruled the fates of entire clans, interfering in the politics and economy of the country. He installed a new shogun, Ashikaga Yoshiaki, but he quickly turned into his puppet, obediently carrying out his will, while the real threat to his power remained the powerful religious orders, unwilling to recognize his authority and striving to maintain their independence. Especially dangerous were the warriors from the Iko-Iki sect, fanatically devoted to their faith and openly calling on the people to fight against Nobunaga, considering him an enemy of Buddhism and a destroyer of traditions. Warrior monks from various schools were battle-hardened fighters, experienced warriors, ready to give their lives for their faith. But they had another strength that most daimyo could not afford, a fanatical devotion to their faith, a willingness to die for their beliefs. They were ready to give their lives for their religion, for their ideals, for their freedom. They built veritable fortresses, armed themselves to the teeth, and formed huge armies, which included not only professional warriors, but also peasants, artisans, and merchants, ready to fight for their cause. In short, everyone who believed in their righteous cause, who shared their beliefs, and who was ready to give their lives for their faith. When Nobunaga began demanding obedience from the Buddhist orders, demanding that they recognize his authority and submit to his laws, he was met with refusal. He encountered fierce resistance. They launched uprisings in the cities, carried out acts of sabotage, and their spies worked throughout his domains, trying to turn the people against him and undermine his power. In response, he began to act with the same ruthlessness with which he had triumphed on the battlefield, showing not the slightest mercy to his enemies. He was not simply going to subdue the monks, to force them to submit to his will. He intended to destroy the very system in which they possessed political and military power, depriving them of any opportunity to influence the course of events. The main spiritual and military center of Buddhism was the powerful Enryakuji Monastery, located on Mount Hiei, not far from Kyoto. It was an impregnable fortress, standing on Mount Hiei, from where the monks had controlled Kyoto for centuries, interfering in politics and influencing the decisions of rulers. It was believed that if you ruled in Kyoto but did not have the support of Enryakuji, then your power was temporary, that sooner or later you would be overthrown. Thousands of warrior monks lived in this fortress, protected by nature itself and powerful walls, ready to fight for their faith to the last drop of blood. Many daimyo, fearing their power and influence, preferred to avoid them and sidestep conflicts, understanding that a head-on attack would come at too steep a price, resulting in tremendous losses and undermining their authority. But Nobunaga did not believe in compromises, recognized no authority other than his own will, and was prepared to do anything to achieve his goals. In 1571, he made a decision that shook all of Japan, filling both his enemies and allies with horror and dread. He ordered his troops to surround Mount Hiei and completely obliterate the Enryakuji monastery, erasing it from the face of the earth, leaving no stone unturned. But this was not a battle, but a true extermination, a mass slaughter unlike any other in Japanese history. When Nobunaga's army approached the monastery, no one expected him to go all the way, to actually dare to destroy a shrine revered for centuries. The monks anticipated that, as in previous centuries, everything would be limited to negotiations, that Nobunaga would compromise and agree to a peaceful resolution of the conflict. Perhaps they would get away with a symbolic tribute, acknowledging his authority and paying him a small sum of money. But this time, there were no negotiations. Nobunaga was not going to negotiate with anyone. The soldiers were not going to storm the monastery, fighting the warrior monks and suffering casualties. They set it on fire immediately, using torches and incendiary arrows. The fire began to engulf the wooden buildings, blazing like dry grass, quickly spreading throughout the monastery grounds. The flames soared into the sky, illuminating the surrounding area and turning night into day, while the smoke obscured the horizon, creating an ominous atmosphere. The monks, gripped by terror, tried to escape the fire, breaking through the ranks of soldiers, but were met with swords that ruthlessly cut short their lives. Women, the elderly, and children caught in the epicenter of the tragedy begged for mercy. But Nobunaga spared no one, ordering everyone to be destroyed indiscriminately. Some burned alive in their cells, unable to escape the fiery trap, while others ran out, hoping to escape the flames, only to be met by Nobunaga's warriors, ready to finish off anyone who tried to flee. It is believed that more than 20,000 people died that night, becoming victims of cruelty and fanaticism. Mount Hiei, which for centuries had been a sacred place, a symbol of spirituality and peace, became a mass grave, forever stained with the blood of innocent victims. When the fire died down by morning and the smoke cleared, nothing remained of Enryakuji except charred ruins and ashes, bearing witness to its former glory. When news of what had happened spread throughout Japan, even the most hardened samurai, accustomed to violence and bloodshed, were shocked by Nobunaga's cruelty. Buddhist monasteries had existed for centuries. Their influence was considered unshakable. They were respected and feared, and no one before had dared to destroy them to their foundations, defying the very gods. Even the most cruel and ruthless warlords, accustomed to wars and killings, respected the gods, holy places, and religious rituals, trying not to offend them with their behavior. After Oda Nobunaga brutally broke the power of the Buddhist monasteries, destroying the Enryakuji temple and subjugating Kyoto, it seemed that there were no serious obstacles left in his path, that all of Japan would soon be under his rule. However, far to the west, beyond his influence, remained a powerful force that was not going to recognize his dominance and was ready to fight for its independence. This was the renowned and ancient Mori clan, which controlled vast territories on the west coast of Japan, rich in resources and possessing significant military power. By this time, the Mori clan had wielded impressive military and economic power for several generations, allowing it to withstand even the strongest enemies. Their lands included key trading ports and rice-rich provinces, generating huge revenues, and most importantly, the strongest navy in Japan, consisting of numerous ships, controlling the entire inland sea and allowing the Mori clan to dominate the region. The Mori's holdings stretched across many provinces, from which they could draw resources almost endlessly, allowing them to maintain a large army and wage long wars. And their castles were considered almost impregnable, protected by strong walls and experienced garrisons. If Nobunaga truly wanted to unite the country under his rule, he could not afford to leave such a dangerous adversary in the west. He could not allow the existence of a force capable of challenging his authority and undermining his dominance. Understanding this, in 1578, Oda Nobunaga launched a large-scale campaign against the Mori clan, determined to break their resistance and subjugate them to his will. His main task was to capture the key castles controlling the approaches to the western provinces, and thereby break the economic power of the Mori clan, depriving them of the ability to finance their army and wage war. But he understood perfectly well that this time the war would be different, that he would face serious resistance, and that victory would not be easy. The Mori not only had a strong army and impregnable fortresses, but they also outnumbered him at sea, something Nobunaga had not yet experienced, posing a serious threat to him. Nobunaga approached the war with the Mori clan systematically and thoroughly, developing a detailed campaign plan and mobilizing all his resources. He sent his best commanders against the Mori, including the talented Toyotomi Hideyoshi, who was to besiege Takamatsu Castle, a strategically important fortress of the Mori clan, which controlled important trade routes. At the same time, he made an alliance with the Otomo clan from Kyushu Island, which was to help him weaken the Mori's positions in the south, diverting their forces and preventing them from transferring troops to the main front. For the first time in the history of Japanese warfare, the campaign was conducted not by separate battles, but by planned and coordinated operations in several directions simultaneously, demonstrating Nobunaga's strategic genius and his ability to organize large-scale military operations. However, the Mori clan was not going to surrender without a fight, was not going to admit defeat, and was ready to fight for its independence to the last drop of blood. His warriors desperately defended every castle, using all the resources available to them, demonstrating their courage and loyalty to their clan. They blocked roads, set ambushes, conducted nighttime raids on enemy camps, inflicting significant damage, and actively used their fleet to support fortresses from the sea, block supplies, and hinder the siege. While besieging Takamatsu Castle, Nobunaga's troops faced fierce defense. Their attacks were repeatedly repulsed with heavy losses, and they were forced to use engineering tricks to break the enemy's resistance. They built huge dams to flood the castle and force the defenders to surrender, creating an artificial lake and flooding the surrounding lands. This struggle turned into a protracted war of resources and patience, in which Nobunaga had almost won, breaking the enemy's resistance and depriving them of the ability to resist. It seemed that victory was near, and all of Western Japan would soon be in his hands, that his dream of uniting the country was about to become a reality. But at that very moment, in the midst of a decisive battle in 1582, something happened that no one could have foreseen, an event that turned the course of history and changed the fate of Japan. While Nobunaga was fully engaged in the war with the Mori in the west, betrayal awaited him in the very heart of his own empire, preparing to strike a deadly blow. Nobunaga believed that he was finally close to achieving the main goal of his life, to uniting all of Japan under his own hand, to creating a strong and united state. But behind his back, the clouds of conspiracy were already gathering, which would forever change the fate of the country, plunging it into chaos and strife. Nobunaga had always believed that his power rested not only on the force of arms, not only on his military power, but also on strict discipline among his subordinates, on their unquestioning obedience to his will. He often demonstrated severity and ruthlessness, even cruelty, towards those he suspected of disloyalty, in order to keep his vassals in fear and obedience. But in recent years, having reached the peak of power and glory, he had become too accustomed to the idea of his absolute superiority, believing in his infallibility and losing vigilance. While he was waging war in the West, seeking to subjugate the Mori clan, a treacherous plan was brewing in his inner circle, carefully developed and prepared, the main protagonist of which was Akechi Mitsuhide, one of Nobunaga's closest and most trusted generals, who enjoyed his complete confidence. Akechi Mitsuhide was an ambitious, intelligent, and calculating man who knew how to hide his true feelings and intentions. He had long remained a loyal ally of Nobunaga, served him faithfully, carrying out all his orders, but could not reconcile himself to the fact that he often humiliated his associates, did not respect their dignity, and forced them to obey his will at any cost, regardless of their feelings and needs. Gradually, these grievances and discontents, which had accumulated in Akechi's soul for years, turned into a thirst for revenge, into a desire to punish Nobunaga for all the humiliation and insults. He understood perfectly well that it was pointless to openly oppose Nobunaga, that he did not have a single chance to defeat him in open combat. It was necessary to strike a precise, quick, and unexpected blow, seize the moment, and deprive him of the ability to resist. A blow from which it would be impossible to recover, which would deprive him of power and life. Such a chance arose in 1582, when Nobunaga, completely confident in his success and imminent victory over the Mori clan, went to Kyoto with a small guard to rest from the hardships of war and prepare for the celebrations of the upcoming victory, which were to strengthen his power and glorify his name. He stayed at the Honnoji Temple, a place that was a familiar refuge for him, where he felt safe and could rest peacefully from his worries. He had no idea that he was trapped, skillfully prepared by Akechi, that he had been betrayed by his closest and most trusted people. On the night of June 2nd, Akechi Mitsuhide and his army suddenly surrounded the temple, blocking all exits and preventing him from escaping. Nobunaga awoke to the sound of battle cries erupting from every direction, and he knew he had been betrayed, that his demise was imminent. He, who had always controlled events, maintained command of the situation, and anticipated his enemy's actions, was caught completely off guard, unable to resist. A tiger trapped in a cage, historians would later call this tragic event, emphasizing the suddenness and mercilessness of the betrayal. Akechi's warriors stormed into the temple, pushing back Nobunaga's few defenders, who offered fierce resistance. It seemed the warlord had no chance of escape, that certain death awaited him, but he decided to fight one last battle, worthy of his life, demonstrating his courage and martial skill. Nobunaga fought desperately, killing everyone who entered the temple hall, delivering crushing blows and preventing the enemies from getting close to him. But there were too many opponents, their numbers far exceeded the number of defenders, and they fell one by one, dying like heroes. When he realized that the battle was lost, that there was no help coming, and that a shameful death at the hands of traitors awaited him, Nobunaga made the only decision worthy of a samurai, to preserve his honor and avoid capture. He retreated deep into the burning temple, engulfed in flames, and committed seppuku, not allowing his enemies to witness his death and desecrate his body. Seppuku, also known as ritual suicide by disembowelment, was considered an honorable way for a samurai to end his life, a way to prove his loyalty to duty and avoid dishonor. With the passing of Oda Nobunaga, killed by a traitor, ended an era of great change initiated by him, an era of reforms and transformations that changed the face of Japan. He did not manage to complete the work of his life. He could not unite the country under his rule and create a strong, unified state. In an instant, all his work, all his conquests were on the verge of collapse. His empire crumbled, and the country plunged back into chaos and infighting, as if rolled back in time. The conspiracy of Akechi Mitsuhide changed everything, reversed the course of history, and opened the way to power for completely different people who, however, had already been educated by Nobunaga, were his followers, and were ready to continue his work, but went to their goal in completely different ways. But he himself would not see this. His name will remain in history as the name of a great reformer and warlord who changed Japan. His last battle at Honnoji was not only a tragic end to his life, but also a turning point for all of Japan, determining its future destiny. After the death of Oda Nobunaga, Japan was once again on the brink of full-scale chaos. The country plunged into turmoil and infighting, each daimyo seeking to seize power and expand their domains. The news of Nobunaga's betrayal and sudden death caught Tokugawa Ieyasu in an extremely unfavorable position, far from his lands and his army. He was in Osaka, far from his lands and army, surrounded by territories where supporters of the traitor Akechi Mitsuhide could appear at any moment, posing a deadly threat to him. Ieyasu instantly realized that his life hung by a thread, that he was in mortal danger, and that the journey home to Mikawa province would be difficult and perilous, full of surprises and traps. Nobunaga's death instantly changed the political balance of power in the country, creating a power vacuum that everyone sought to fill. Akechi Mitsuhide's army began searching for allies and enemies of the former lord to consolidate his power and destroy his opponents, while supporters of the defeated Nobunaga were confused, not knowing what to do and whom to swear allegiance to. Many of those who had been allies of Tokugawa Ieyasu yesterday could become his enemies today, seeking to take advantage of the situation and seize his lands. The Akechi forces posed a particularly great threat to him, as it was important for them to eliminate the last powerful ally of the slain daimyo, depriving him of the opportunity to avenge Nobunaga's death. It was from them that Ieyasu and his people had to hide, trying to avoid clashes and save their lives. The way home to Mikawa province lay through Iga province, inhabited by ninja. A place that, during the Warring States period, was considered perhaps the most dangerous in Japan, where death lurked at every turn. The lands of Iga were inhabited by ninja clans, masters of covert warfare, whose art of disguise, espionage, sabotage, and silent assassination terrified even the most experienced and battle-hardened samurai, making them tremble with fear. Few dared to invade the territory of these clans, fearing their revenge and preferring to avoid them. Armies, not knowing the terrain, were lost in dense forests. Warriors disappeared without a trace, not even understanding what had happened to them, becoming victims of skilled assassins. To pass through the lands of Iga province without their consent meant guaranteed death, incurring the wrath of the ninja clans and being destroyed. Ieyasu understood this perfectly, realizing the full danger of the situation, but he simply had no other way home to his native Mikawa province. However, among his loyal comrades was a man who not only knew how to safely pass through the hostile ninja territories, but also possessed sufficient authority and influence to negotiate with their leaders, secure their support, and ensure safe passage for Tokugawa's detachment. This was Hattori Hanzo, a legendary warrior from Mikawa province, whose life was closely connected with Iga province, whose name struck terror into enemies and was respected among ninja. He was born into a samurai family, but grew up among ninja, studying their art and adopting their skills from childhood, perfectly mastering both paths, both the path of the samurai and the path of the master of covert warfare, combining the best qualities of a warrior and a spy. It was for this unique combination of lightning speed, ruthlessness, and cunning, for his ability to quickly and efficiently destroy enemies, that he received his famous nickname, Demon Hanzo, which terrified all who heard of him. He was respected and feared by both enemies and allies. His name was a symbol of strength and power. It was Hanzo who took responsibility for saving Tokugawa Ieyasu, realizing that his life and the future of his clan depended on it. He personally went to Iga province, where he entered into negotiations with the local ninja clans, persuading them to help Tokugawa safely pass through their lands, promising them his support and protection in the future. However, the danger was still immense, despite the support of the ninja. Pursuers sent by Akechi Mitsuhide were everywhere. They were combing the area in search of Tokugawa, sparing no effort or resources. These were not just ordinary samurai, but also highly trained scouts and trackers who knew the area and knew how to track down their prey, who scoured the mountains and forests in search of the fugitive, striving at all costs to fulfill their order. They knew that the future of Japan depended on the success of this operation, that capturing or killing Tokugawa would significantly strengthen Akechi's position and allow him to seize power. If Ieyasu were captured or killed, Akechi would be able to strengthen his position, completely destroying Nobunaga's legacy, and the country would plunge into chaos and anarchy. Hanzo's detachment moved exclusively at night, trying to avoid roads and open spaces so as not to attract attention. The ninja from Iga led them along secret paths through dense forests and mountain passes, setting deadly traps along the way for the pursuers, to delay them and give Tokugawa's detachment time to escape. When Akechi's scouts did find their trail, Hattori Hanzo and his fighters engaged in lightning-fast clashes, striking the enemies with such speed and surprise that they did not have time to understand where death was falling on them from. According to the recollections of contemporaries, the pursuers lost one detachment after another in these forests, suffering huge losses and not achieving any results, which eventually forced them to abandon the pursuit, admitting their defeat. After several days of deadly and tense travel through the lands of Iga province, Tokugawa and his people managed to escape to a safe territory, avoiding pursuers and saving their lives. He returned home alive only thanks to the exceptional skill, courage, and cunning of Hattori Hanzo, who saved his life, demonstrating his loyalty and talent as a commander. Since then, Ieyasu has highly valued Hanzo, turning the ninja from Iga province into his own elite secret police, using them to collect information and carry out secret operations, and making Hanzo himself the commander of the guard unit, entrusting him with his life. The samurai, who only yesterday swore allegiance to Nobunaga, were now ready to fight each other for a place in the sun. For the power and influence left by their lord, the country was again plunged into chaos and infighting. Among the many warlords who tried to take advantage of the situation, consolidate their power, and seize lands, was a man whose origin and past differed greatly from the rest, standing out against the background of noble samurai. This was Toyotomi Hideyoshi, an ambitious and talented military commander, ready to do anything to achieve his goal. Hideyoshi was born a peasant in a poor family and did not belong to noble samurai families. His origin was an insurmountable obstacle on the way to power. His path to the top of power was incredible and unprecedented by the standards of traditional Japan, where status, origin, and belonging to a noble family were everything, determined a person's fate and opened the way to power for him. Having begun his service with Nobunaga as a simple squire, performing the dirtiest and most difficult work, he quickly showed his talents, proving himself to be unusually quick-witted, cunning, and able to achieve results at any cost, stopping at nothing. Thanks to these qualities, as well as his devotion and hard work, he rose rapidly, step by step, rising from the mud into the elite of samurai society, becoming an influential and respected person. By the time of Nobunaga's death, he was already one of his most trusted generals, a man to whom the Lord entrusted the most difficult and responsible tasks, highly valuing his mind and talent. Now, following Nobunaga's death, the moment had arrived for Hideyoshi to seize control of his own destiny, capitalize on the situation, and grasp power, ultimately reaching the pinnacle of might. Upon hearing the news of Nobunaga's demise at Honnoji Temple, Hideyoshi instantly understood that his time to act had come, that this was his opportunity to reshape his life and seize power, uniting Japan under his rule. However, the initial obstacle in his path was Akechi Mitsuhide, the man who had betrayed and murdered Nobunaga, thus becoming his principal adversary. Mitsuhide anticipated that Nobunaga's army, left without command and demoralized by the death of their leader, would be unable to respond swiftly to his treachery, allowing him to consolidate his power and take control of the country. But he underestimated Hideyoshi's speed and resolve, his ability to make rapid decisions and act without hesitation. In just a matter of days, displaying his diplomatic prowess and forging advantageous agreements, Hideyoshi managed to make peace with the Mori clan, with whom he had been warring in the west, ending the conflict and freeing his troops. He then swiftly redeployed them back towards Kyoto, seeking to avenge Nobunaga's death and punish the traitor. In the year 1582, the two armies led by Hideyoshi and Mitsuhide met in battle at Yamazaki to determine who would wield power in Japan. Akechi Mitsuhide, self-assured and convinced of his righteousness, was caught off guard by Hideyoshi's sudden appearance, which he had not anticipated so soon, believing Hideyoshi to be far to the west, engaged in war with the Mori clan. The battle proved to be swift and brutal, and Mitsuhide's army, taken by surprise and failing to prepare for defense, was utterly routed, suffering immense casualties. The traitor himself fled the battlefield, attempting to escape pursuit, but was soon slain by local peasants, avenging their lord's death and expressing their loyalty to the Oda clan. By then, no one doubted that Toyotomi Hideyoshi had become the heir to Oda Nobunaga, the most powerful warlord in Japan, possessing sufficient strength and influence to continue his work and unite the country under his banner. But for him, this was only the beginning of the journey, merely the initial step towards achieving his ultimate goal, the creation of a strong and unified nation. Other generals of Nobunaga, such as Tokugawa Ieyasu and Shibata Katsuie, also harbored their own ambitions and strived for power, and therefore the war for dominance, initiated by Nobunaga, continued, plunging the country into chaos and internecine strife. Nevertheless, Hideyoshi acted with composure and calculation, meticulously planning each step and leaving his enemies not even a sliver of opportunity for victory. He forged alliances where it benefited him, joining forces with those who could aid him in achieving his goal, and mercilessly eliminated those who attempted to challenge his right to leadership, demonstrating his strength and determination. One of Hideyoshi's most significant and decisive victories was the battle at Shizugatake in the year 1583, in which he definitively crushed the forces of his main rivals from the Shibata clan, stripping them of any possibility of claiming power and solidifying his own position. Following that crushing defeat, no one could seriously challenge him. No one dared to openly oppose him, understanding that it would mean certain doom. And those daimyo who still doubted his strength and power hastened to acknowledge his authority, swear allegiance to him, and form alliances with him so as not to repeat the fate of his previous adversaries, unwilling to expose themselves and their lands to danger. Thus, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, a former peasant, hailing from the very bottom of society, achieved what seemed impossible, proving that in Japan, as in any other country, talent and perseverance can unlock the doors to the summits of power. He unified Japan under his rule, ending a war that had lasted for decades and accomplishing what Oda Nobunaga had failed to complete, having perished at the hands of a traitor. Now he was not merely an influential daimyo, but the de facto ruler of the country, wielding immense power and enjoying both respect and fear. For the first time in history, a person of such humble origins had risen to the highest position in the state, subjugating the proud samurai and compelling them to accept his authority, shattering centuries-old traditions and foundations of Japanese society. Japan had entered a new era in which lineage and tradition no longer played the primary role, but rather the abilities, talent, and will of one individual, his skill in achieving his goals. His power became absolute. He could make any decisions, and no one dared to contradict him. He had obtained everything that a peasant from a poor family, raised in poverty and having no prospects, could once only dream of. He governed a vast country. His orders were carried out by thousands of samurai, ready to give their lives for him, and his name was pronounced with trepidation and respect even by enemies who acknowledged his strength and might. But Hideyoshi, despite his successes, had no intention of stopping there. He strived for more. For him, the unification of Japan was only the initial step, a prelude to something greater, to the realization of a grand plan that no Japanese ruler before him had even dared to dream of, considering the goal impossible. Hideyoshi conceived the idea of conquering China, the greatest empire in East Asia, a land with immense wealth, ancient culture, and inexhaustible resources, wielding enormous influence in the region. It was a goal worthy of a great conqueror, as he considered himself to be, a dream that could bring him glory and power surpassing that of all his predecessors. But on the path to China lay Korea, which was unwilling to allow Japanese armies to pass through its lands, refusing to support his plans of conquest. Then Hideyoshi decided to first invade Korea, to use it as a staging ground for the conquest of China, to subjugate it to his rule, and to utilize its resources to finance his military campaign. In the year 1592, the first phase of the grand invasion began, which was meant to bring him glory and wealth, making him the most powerful ruler in the world. A massive army, numbering nearly 160,000 warriors, was transported across the sea and swiftly invaded the Korean peninsula, encountering little serious resistance. Initially, the success of the Japanese forces was impressive. They rapidly seized several major cities, defeated Korean troops in multiple battles, and began to advance swiftly into the interior of the country, approaching their goal. However, this initial victory proved to be merely an illusion of an easy triumph, a deceptive appearance concealing serious problems and difficulties. Korea turned out not to be the kind of enemy that could be conquered with a swift blow, one that was ready to surrender without a fight, acknowledging the superiority of the Japanese army. Korean soldiers and local militia, inspired by patriotism, began to resist the invaders desperately, employing guerrilla warfare tactics, ambushing, attacking Japanese supply lines, and disrupting their communications, wearing down the enemy and inflicting significant damage. To make matters worse, the powerful Chinese Ming Empire sided with Korea, concerned about Japan's growing strength and unwilling to allow its dominance in the region, sending a large army to assist the Koreans in stopping the Japanese invasion. The Japanese army, mired in endless battles and constant guerrilla attacks, began to experience a severe shortage of food and supplies. Its advance slowed, and it found itself in a difficult situation. The war turned into a protracted and bloody conflict that Hideyoshi had not anticipated at all, having expected a swift victory and not supposing that he would encounter such fierce resistance. The most severe blow for the Japanese was the war at sea, where they suffered a crushing defeat at the hands of the Korean Navy. Admiral Yi Sun-sin, the greatest Korean naval commander, a brilliant strategist and talented tactician, inflicted a devastating defeat on the Japanese fleet in several naval battles, depriving them of the ability to control the sea and support their army on the Korean coast. Without maritime communications and support from the sea, the Japanese army found itself cut off from resources and reinforcements. Its position became critical. Soldiers began to die of hunger and disease, morale collapsed, and commanders began to doubt the success of the entire campaign, realizing that their dream of conquering China had crumbled. Hideyoshi was dismayed and enraged by the failure of his dream. His ambitions were wounded, and his pride was insulted. He once again attempted to turn the tide, hoping that he would manage to achieve victory despite all the difficulties. In the year 1597, he sent a second enormous army to Korea, hoping that it would be able to break the resistance of the Koreans and Chinese. But the situation, unfortunately, repeated itself. The Japanese once again became mired in a grueling war, faced fierce resistance from the Koreans and Chinese, and were unable to advance beyond the Korean coast, suffering enormous losses and achieving no significant successes. At this time, the health of Toyotomi Hideyoshi himself was rapidly deteriorating. His strength was waning with each passing day, and he felt the approach of death. He understood that his grand plan had failed, that his dream of conquering China would not come true, but he could no longer change anything. He did not have the strength to turn the tide. In the year 1598, Toyotomi Hideyoshi died, never seeing the completion of his most ambitious dream, failing to conquer China and create a great empire. His death signaled the immediate disintegration of the empire that he had so painstakingly built over many years, conquering lands and subjugating peoples. Warlords who returned from the unsuccessful Korean War, weary of endless battles and disillusioned by the failure of the campaign, immediately began a struggle for power, seeking to seize control of the country, and the unity that Hideyoshi had achieved at a tremendous cost, shedding blood and destroying his enemies, instantly collapsed like a house of cards. Thus ended the era of Toyotomi Hideyoshi, a peasant who managed to conquer Japan but failed to conquer the world, dreaming of a great empire but never managing to realize his dream. Hideyoshi managed to almost completely unify the country under his rule. But after his death, it became clear that the system he had created was too fragile, relying solely on his authority and strength. His primary heir and successor was his 5-year-old son, Toyotomi Hideyori, too young and inexperienced to govern a vast country on his own, incapable of making complex decisions and controlling the situation. The boy found himself under the sway of advisors and regents appointed by Hideyoshi before his death to help him rule the country, among whom Tokugawa Ieyasu stood out, possessing immense power and influence. Hideyoshi, sensing his imminent death and fearing for the fate of his heir, tried to anticipate potential problems and prevent a power struggle by creating a council of 5 elders, consisting of the most influential daimyo of Japan, who were to jointly govern the country until Hideyori came of age. Tokugawa Ieyasu was just one of its members, but his ambition and lust for power surpassed all other members of the council combined. He dreamed of becoming the ruler of Japan and was not content to be one of many. Soon after Hideyoshi's death, Tokugawa began to violate the established rules, ignoring the council's decisions and acting in his own interests. Against all prohibitions, he entered into marriage alliances with other clans, strengthened his power, and formed his own coalition of supporters, preparing for a power struggle and creating a base for seizing control of the country. Naturally, these actions alarmed the other members of the council, especially the powerful Ishida Mitsunari, who saw in Ieyasu not only a threat to his influence, but also a danger to the entire legacy of Hideyoshi, fearing that he would seize power and destroy everything Hideyoshi had created. Ishida was not a warrior, not a commander, but a politician and official, a man accustomed to achieving his goals through diplomacy, intrigue, and backroom deals, skilled at finding common ground with different people. He began actively forming a coalition against Tokugawa, trying to unite the western provinces against the threat from the east. to resist his ambitions and preserve the power of the Toyotomi clan. Soon, all of Japan was divided into two parts. The Western coalition, led by Ishida Mitsunari, supported the young Hideyori and formally recognized his authority, while the eastern lands stood behind Tokugawa Ieyasu, ready to fight for his interests and help him seize power. But Ieyasu, as a wise and experienced politician, was in no hurry to openly start a war, understanding that it could lead to unpredictable consequences. He understood that battle was only a last resort, to be used only when all other methods had been exhausted, when there was no other way to achieve his goal. Instead of a direct confrontation, he began to actively use diplomacy, bribery, blackmail, and espionage, seeking to weaken his enemies and lure as many allies as possible to his side. His people carefully collected information about his opponents, analyzing their weaknesses, inclinations, addictions, and grievances, in order to use this knowledge to his advantage. Ieyasu personally negotiated with influential daimyo, offering generous promises, money, and lands to those who were willing to switch to his side, tempting them with power and wealth. Thus, he was not merely gathering an army, preparing for a decisive battle, but weakening his opponents even before they could start a war, depriving them of support and undermining their morale. A particularly important figure in this hidden game was the young Kobayakawa Hideaki, whose choice could tip the scales in either direction, changing the course of history. He commanded a large army and was formally an ally of the Western coalition, but he was dissatisfied with his position and craved power. Ieyasu, taking advantage of his ambitions, secretly promised him large territories, a high position in the new Japan, and influence at court if he switched to his side at the decisive moment, betraying his allies. Thus, even before the start of the battle, Tokugawa had done everything to ensure that his enemies were surrounded not only on the battlefield, but also in a political sense, depriving them of support and allies. As the two sides began to prepare for the inevitable battle, its outcome had already been determined by secret diplomacy and cunning games. The outcome of the war was predetermined. Tokugawa understood that the outcome of the war would be decided not only by the power of weapons, but also by the ability to negotiate, weave intrigues, and exploit the weaknesses of his enemies, that the one who knew his enemy best and could use his weaknesses to his advantage would win. And although many of the participants in the upcoming battle did not yet know it, victory was already on Tokugawa's side, thanks to his ability to plan, anticipate potential difficulties, and defeat his enemies even before their armies met on the battlefield, depriving them of the ability to resist. The morning of October 21st, 1600 arrived, a day that would decide the fate of Japan. A thick fog that enveloped the surroundings slowly dissipated over the plain of Sekigahara, revealing to the eyes of the warriors a grandiose picture, impressive in its scale. Two huge armies, clad in armor and ready to give their lives for their ideals, were preparing to enter into a deadly battle, the outcome of which would determine the future of the entire country, deciding who would become the new ruler of Japan. The Western coalition, led by Ishida Mitsunari, was determined. Its warriors were full of resolve to win and avenge the death of Toyotomi Hideyoshi, believing that their numerical superiority and advantageous position on the battlefield would give them an undeniable advantage over the enemy. On the other hand, Tokugawa Ieyasu, calm and confident in his victory, stood at the head of his army, because he had already prepared a decisive blow in advance, one that his opponents did not even suspect, having carefully planned every step. And so, with the first rays of the sun piercing through the fog and illuminating the battlefield, battle cries rang out, shaking the air, and the armies began to converge, preparing for a deadly clash. The battlefield instantly plunged into chaos and turmoil, turning into an arena of fierce battles where the fate of Japan was being decided. Arrows shot from bows, the sounds of arquebuses echoing around, and the clang of colliding swords filled the air, creating a deafening cacophony of sounds. At first, it seemed that Ishida's troops were gaining the upper hand, that the Western coalition was winning. Powerful units of the Western coalition advanced with tremendous force, sweeping everything in their path, and the ranks of Ieyasu's warriors began to slowly retreat, unable to withstand the enemy's onslaught. With each passing hour, the situation for Tokugawa became increasingly dangerous. His army suffered heavy losses, and victory seemed increasingly unattainable. However, Tokugawa Ieyasu was in no hurry to take desperate measures, did not give in to panic, and continued to carefully watch Matsuo Hill, where the army of Kobayakawa Hideaki stood, on whom the outcome of the battle depended. This young daimyo, commanding a large and well-equipped army, was the key to victory. His decision could change the course of the battle in either direction. He took up a position on the hill, observing the course of the battle, but did not engage in the fighting, waiting for the right moment to make a decision. Ishida Mitsunari's army was counting on his support, unaware that Kobayakawa had long been conducting secret negotiations with Ieyasu, who had promised him power and wealth. However, at the most decisive moment of the battle, when both sides were suffering heavy losses, the young warlord hesitated and wavered, unable to make a final decision and betray his allies. The minutes stretched on agonizingly long. It seemed that he would never be able to make a choice, that he would remain true to his allies and would not enter the battle. Tokugawa, realizing that further delay could cost him victory, could no longer wait. He needed to act. In despair and anger, resolving on a desperate step, he ordered his troops to open fire on Kobayakawa's troops, forcing him to make a decision under threat of reprisal. This desperate gamble paid off, working as Tokugawa had hoped. Feeling a real threat, and realizing that doubts and procrastination could cost him his life, that he could lose everything, Kobayakawa Hideaki finally raised his flag, ordered his army to attack, and rushed into battle, but not against Tokugawa, but against his former ally, Ishida Mitsunari, betraying those who had counted on his support. For the Western army, this was a real shock, an unexpected and crushing blow that turned the tide of the battle. Kobayakawa's warriors suddenly fell on the rear of the Western coalition, attacking from the hill, sowing panic and confusion in the ranks of the enemy. This betrayal proved fatal for Ishida, depriving his army of any chance of victory. His soldiers, who had recently considered themselves victors and were confident in their strength, were now trapped on two sides, attacked from both the front and the rear. Panic gripped the troops of the Western coalition, discipline collapsed, and in a matter of hours, the seemingly mighty Western coalition was defeated and put to flight, unable to withstand the onslaught of the enemy. This was the moment when an entire era ended, when the old world gave way to the new. The Battle of Sekigahara meant the end of 100 years of continuous wars, the end of the endless struggle for power, where every daimyo was ready to fight for a scrap of land or prestige, where chaos and lawlessness reigned. With this victory, Tokugawa Ieyasu not only eliminated the last serious rival, gaining power over Japan, he paved the way for a new order, for the peace that Japan had dreamed of for decades, for stability and prosperity. After the victory at Sekigahara, Tokugawa became the most powerful man in Japan. No one could challenge him anymore, no one dared to contradict his will. All power was in his hands, and his main opponents were either dead or defeated, and no longer posed a threat. However, he still had to consolidate his dominance, eliminate the last potential rivals, and finally rebuild the country according to his vision of order, in order to ensure stability and prosperity for many years to come. Immediately after the Battle of Sekigahara, Tokugawa demonstrated both severity and prudence, not forgiving betrayal and not allowing chaos. He dealt with the main leaders of the losing side in order to punish them for rebellion and prevent new uprisings. Ishida Mitsunari was captured and executed in Kyoto, along with other key opponents who refused to concede defeat and swear allegiance to Tokugawa. However, those daimyo who quickly showed submission acknowledged his authority, and expressed their loyalty, were not only pardoned, but also allowed to retain their lands and titles, though often in smaller sizes than before. This demonstrated not only his strength and resolve, but also his foresight, understanding that excessive cruelty would only create new enemies, and that it was better to show mercy and win over former adversaries. Many samurai who had fought against him the day before now became his allies, seeing in him a strong and wise ruler capable of uniting the country and establishing peace. One such daimyo, forgiven by Tokugawa, was Kobayakawa Hideaki, whose decision to join the battle on Tokugawa's side, betraying his allies, ultimately changed the course of Japanese history, bringing him victory and power over the country. After the Battle of Sekigahara, Ieyasu generously rewarded Kobayakawa with new domains, elevating his status and strengthening his influence. But Kobayakawa himself, despite the wealth and power he received, could not find peace of mind for a long time. His conscience tormented him, and he was haunted by thoughts of betrayal. His name forever became synonymous with treachery, a symbol of dishonor and deceit, tarnishing his reputation. He suffered agonizingly over what he had done, repenting of his actions, and, as historians say, spent the last years of his life in deep contemplation, haunted by tormenting thoughts of betrayal, unable to find peace and not knowing how to atone for his guilt. Kobayakawa died just 2 years after the Battle of Sekigahara, never finding peace of mind, unable to get rid of the pangs of conscience and atone for his sin. Meanwhile, Tokugawa Ieyasu, wasting no time, quickly consolidated his power, destroying his enemies and strengthening his influence in the country. He assumed the title of shogun in 1603, officially reviving the shogunate, which had long been in decline, and beginning the reign of the new Tokugawa dynasty, which would rule Japan for more than 260 years, establishing peace and prosperity in the country. Thus, centuries of bloody civil wars, chaos and fragmentation finally ended, giving way to an era of stability and prosperity. The Edo period began, a time of stability, economic prosperity, and strict control over the entire country, marking a new chapter in Japanese history. Tokugawa, as a wise and far-sighted ruler, did not repeat the mistakes of his predecessors, did not seek conquests beyond Japan, and did not plan to conquer China and neighboring lands, as Toyotomi Hideyoshi had dreamed. He understood that true power lay not in endless conquests and bloody wars, but in creating a stable system based on fair laws and effective governance, which would exist for centuries after his death, ensuring peace and prosperity for his people. That is why he established the Bakufu, a military government in the city of Edo, which became the center of the country's political life for the next 250 years, governing Japan and ensuring its security. The era of samurai chaos and internecine strife was a thing of the past, giving way to an era of peace and stability. But the memory of it, and the lessons Tokugawa learned from previous mistakes and tragic events, shaped the future of Japan, a country that, thanks to him, was able to find long-awaited peace, stability and prosperity, becoming one of the most developed and powerful countries in the world. So, the Sengoku period, full of blood, betrayals, exploits, and legendary destinies, ended, leaving an indelible mark on Japanese history, having a huge impact on its culture and traditions. Out of chaos and war, a new Japan was born, stable, strong, and completely different than before. A country that managed to overcome difficulties and stand up in the struggle for its existence. The people who were spoken of today, great warriors and commanders, talented politicians and treacherous betrayers, have forever entered the history of Japan, becoming symbols of their era, personifying heroism and cruelty, wisdom and madness, courage and betrayal.